talk. He saw a paper that we published last year, almost a year ago, about the first, about the first extirpation of a vascular plant in the United States linked to sea level rise. And so I'm going to talk about that paper, which is, it's open source, it's available for free online. I encourage you to read it as well. Then I'll also just talk about some of the other conservation work and other cactus work that we have going on down in the Keys. And I'll just say in general, my talks are pretty laid back. If anyone has a question, if I say something you don't understand, or if you see something on the slide you have a question about, feel free to just raise your hand and I'll go ahead. So yeah, the Fairchild Conservation Team, we currently have 9 members. We are in Miami, Florida. The garden has been around for almost a century now, but the conservation team has been around for 40 years. And our stated goal and mission is to reduce extinction risk of vascular plants in South Florida and the Caribbean. So we have a few main groups that we kind of end up focusing on. Our director, Jennifer Posley, some of you may know, is a fern nut. And because of that, we focus on ferns a lot. I also love ferns, but they're also just a group that we have in South Florida. We have a lot of kind of neotropical species that are at the northern limit of their range. We good? Oh, okay. Turn the AC down or up. I never know what's the right way to. But yeah, so we do a lot of rare plant monitoring. We grow a lot of plants. We do reintroductions. We do taxonomic research. Really, kind of any and everything that's needed to conserve rare plants in our region. So our region is important because we are in a global biodiversity hotspot in the Caribbean. And we are also at the edge of another biodiversity hotspot that wasn't always recognized, but it was Reed Noss, who's from this area, that really pushed for this in 2016, and I'm a huge supporter of. If you just look on the right, just the percentage of endemic taxa is incredibly high. It's, you know, you'd be hard pressed to find a region with, you know, at least in North America with higher degrees of endemism. So where we work largely is at kind of the collision, the interface of these two biodiversity hotspots, you know, and it's also an extremely overdeveloped area, you know, so we've lost a lot of habitat. And Reed touched on this in a paper in 2015, just talking about the coastal plain, that, like, yes, it's awesome that is a biodiversity hotspot, but over 85% of the natural vegetation has been highly altered or converted to anthropogenic land cover. So this, you know, this is the same thing in the Caribbean. It's kind of the story across a lot of these, you know, populated areas. So we have a lot of work to do. So yeah, the paper that I'm talking about today is the first US vascular plant extirpation linked to sea level rise with a question mark. This is Pilosocereus millspaughii. And this species was found in Key Largo. And this was, and I'll just say, this was just going to be a paper. Jen and I and most of the other authors are kind of introverted by nature. But we were reached out to by Gerald Pinson, who's a science writer at the University of Florida. He also did his PhD in botany there under Emily Sessa. And he reached out and was like, I think this is an extremely important story. Why don't we put it out to the press? And we were like, oh, okay, no big deal. So we put out this embargoed press release, this term that I learned, that kind of sent the paper around with this release that he wrote with help from us, that journalists could kind of see it first and publish it before our work came out. And so this kind of blew up in our face. It went global. It was published in, I think, 30 different languages and newspapers all over the world. You know, obviously the Palm Beach Post and the Miami Herald kind of beat most of the people to the punch, but George Gann did an interview on NPR. We were on CNN. It was very crazy and unexpected, and got a lot of publicity, you know, for kind of a negative story. But the reason we published the paper was we felt it was a very important data point. Like, we have populations of plants that we lose fairly regularly, unfortunately. But this was the only one of a species in the US, and it was the first one that we could, keeps happening, that was kind of clearly linked to sea level rise. So I'll talk about some of the themes of the paper here. We started on just focusing on the overall biodiversity crisis. Like, it's about more than one species, it's about more than just plants. There's over 1 million species of plants and animals that are at risk of extinction currently. In the continental US, thanks to some great work by Wes Knapp and colleagues, with George Gann was also a co-author on this. They published a paper on extirpated plants, or extinct plants from the US. And there were 65 species that we know of that we've lost kind of in recent history. And most of these were identified through herbarium specimens, people just studying old records and being like, holy cow, this is a new species. And of these, only 7 species are in conservation collections, and I'll talk about that a little more. So they're not fully lost. We also have 22 species that have been extirpated from the US and Canada, meaning they're gone from that region but still found in other places, but we've lost them in our region. In South Florida alone, we've had 5 global extinctions. We have had 77 vascular plants extirpated from the region. So again, gone from our region, still found somewhere else. But we still, one of our focuses, so I also work with the Institute for Regional Conservation. And one of our kind of primary focuses is, you have to protect what you have. So we don't want to lose species anywhere, even if they're found somewhere else. All of these things can add up. So we don't want to lose species anywhere. So we're very big on regional conservation. And of these, 27 we think may be extirpated from the US. From several other studies and work through the IUCN, cacti are regularly recognized as one of the most at-risk groups. In the figure on the top, this is from the IPBES in 2022. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, probably not. But you can see cycads have kind of the highest proportion of at-risk species. That's the one all the way on the bottom. And cacti have very similar numbers. So like cacti and cycads are some of the most at-risk vascular plant groups. And so we also just highlighted, we thought we couldn't just talk about this cactus without talking about the other cacti of the Florida Keys. And I want to take a minute, have people been to the Florida Keys? Is anyone at least vaguely familiar? It's not necessarily what you think of as cactus country. It's not a desert. So a lot of people often ask, like, wait, there's cactus in the Keys, and why are there so many? And I'll get into that a little bit. But we have 8 kind of fully recognized species, and I've put 4 in a box that are endemic. And so Consolea coralicola and Hericea fragrans, these are both federally endangered. Apuntia abjecta and Apuntia ocrocentra are currently in the process of being petitioned for federal listing. I'll talk about that a little more. Apuntia ocrocentra is an interesting case because it's actually an allopolyploid hybrid. So it's basically 2 plant species that hybridized and basically doubled their genome. So we have full sets of chromosomes from both parent species. So it's still fully reproductive, and it's so unique and kind of a stable hybrid that it's now recognized as a species. And this is kind of a prime mechanism for evolution in plants and speciation, and particularly in cacti. And then the last 2 species are species of Pilosocereus, these columnar cacti that we are going to focus on most today. So a little bit about, how cacti got to the Keys. For one, I mean, if we think evolution, we kind of have to think geologic time. I mean, we can go back, to the late Cretaceous. Down here, sea levels were, probably 1/3 of North America was underwater at that point. And as you can see, sea levels have gone up and down over time. So, but right around here, somewhere around 35 million years ago, is when we first see Cactaceae. So those are like the first signs of cactus. And I don't know if you guys know, but cactus are primarily New World, so North and South America. You don't really have cactus in Europe and Africa. You have these very similar kind of convergent evolution, usually euphorbias and things like that that very much look like cactus, but cactus are primarily a New World thing. And so at this time, there was an aridification of the Americas. So things were particularly dry. And this happens again around, the numbers vary, but let's give or take a few million years, about 7 million years ago. And this is where we see this kind of major radiation of Cactaceae. So this is when we start getting new genera and whole groups of new species. So a lot of time went by before we saw that. So it took like this other major aridification event. And this is just an example. This is some work by Lucas Major and colleagues. This is from 2012. Pam and Doug Soltis worked on this. I forget the other authors. But they did a detailed, what they call cytogeography, where they kind of, they could trace the genes and figure out that like, this is for the Clada puntia, but this is true for most cacti that made it into North America. So the center of diversity is down in southern South America. And over kind of millions of years, they made the jump up into North America. So another thing that happened about 2 to 3 million years ago, and any of you guys are particularly interested in the Florida scrub? I know we're kind of on the Lake Wales Ridge here. So this period of the late Pliocene is when a lot of our kind of xerophytic vegetation, things like scrub jays, a lot of these kind of arid ecosystem species, there was a big arid ecosystem all across kind of the southern US at this time, and some of these habitats were more connected. And so it's around this time that all of these kind of xerophytic plants and animals, and I say xerophytic kind of things that like hot, dry conditions. And so you can kind of see this in the cactus species diversity map. We talked about things coming up from South America, and obviously we have this kind of huge desert biome in the southwestern US and goes into Mexico. Yeah. I mainly wanted to show the map, but yeah, they talked about how this particular study was about Prunus geniculata, but mainly where did Prunus maritima come from? And so there was two theories of like at what time it came from Florida. But this, it was the only figure I could find showing this kind of xeric biome going on. And they talk about in this paper a lot, just how this is around the time that kind of scrub habitat was emerging in the southeast. And so if you look on this map, it's nothing like the Southwest, but if you see down in Southeast Florida, and you can't really make out the keys, but it's actually pretty high cactus diversity. And it's the highest cactus diversity east of the Mississippi. And so another thing to consider is during the last kind of glacial maximum, we call it the Wisconsin glaciation. This was, about 20, 30,000 years ago. The sea levels were actually much lower. So you can see that there was, the Bahamas were a much larger landmass, Cuba, obviously the Florida Peninsula. And then there was this other island, the Great Key Sal, kind of between Cuba, Bahamas, and Florida. So things were a little more connected. There was a shorter distance for plants to travel to get between Florida and the Caribbean islands, and also to get kind of across that, that xeric biome. And just some other things about that time, pollen records suggest that Florida remained warm even during this glacial period. We had a lot of, seems to be like the first time that the peninsula is dominated by pines. The Gulf Stream was shut down, and so we have this dry, rocky, sandy conditions in Florida. So there was probably a lot of cactus at this time, and a lot of room for evolution. And over time, I'll just go back here, as the sea levels come up, and the Keys, which are now just this, which would have been the southern edge of this, very diverse peninsula, get isolated largely from the rest of the mainland. So we have a lot of endemic species that have developed in the Keys. Some of them are varieties and subspecies, but a lot of them are full species. So that always blew my mind that it's a relatively young system, geologically speaking. Like, I don't know, like Madagascar, we think of somewhere around 98 million years old. Our stuff is very young comparatively, but still a lot of speciation. So the next thing we talk about in the paper is king tides. And one of the things for me is like when we talk about sea level rise and we look at sea level rise models, they're often these, what we call bathtub models, where the sea level comes up in these really clean increments, and like sea level will be, this many inches higher at this date. But really what we notice, particularly in South Florida, is the changes are a lot more dynamic than that. What we're seeing more than anything is this increase in king tide events. So we get, and king tides are, and again, I'm not a meteorologist, but my understanding of them is they are the spring tides, so like the highest of the moon tides that happen in the, the northern hemisphere. They generally happen around November. So it's when overall we're the closest to the sun and the moon. So it's when we have our strongest tides, and we call them king tides. And these have created, major flooding events, and they just kind of keep getting worse. We see it going up by several inches, just over a few years. And these are some of the stories from Key Largo, where this cactus species was found. On the left is an article from 2019, where we had 10 straight weeks of saltwater flooding in Key Largo, which, a few decades ago was completely unheard of. And then the next year, they're expecting the same thing. And we've seen, it hasn't been as bad as the 2019 flooding, but we're getting this serious king tide flooding every year. So now a little bit about the actual cactus. So Pilosocereus. Has anyone seen a Pilosocereus before? Traveled to the Caribbean? Well, you simply must come down to the Keys. I don't know, for how much longer we'll be able to see these guys. But so the picture on the left is mine that recently was taken at Lange State Park. And I'll just add that these habitats are very dense. And so basically where cactus in general occur in the Keys is at the ecotone, or kind of the interface of where the mangroves meet the hammocks. And kind of the habitat in between is this thing we often refer to as thorn scrub. It's also called Keys tidal rock barren, but basically it's a lot of really spiny, tough plants that kind of eke out a living in this really harsh habitat. They're like somewhat adapted to salt, but they don't like all the shade of the full hammock. So there's this kind of, really narrow transition where the cactus are found. So yeah, the picture on the left was taken at Lange State Park this year. So we still have some really large, healthy individuals there that have a DBH of, close to a foot on some of them. So we're talking about really large trees. The picture on the right is from J.K. Small in 1917. And it's never been clear to me, but it seems like J.K. Small literally cleared the forest to take pictures of these cacti. But I'm telling you, there's no other way to do it. We've tried to take so many good pictures of these cacti, and they just grow in such dense habitat that if you try to get a picture of the full plant, it just looks like a bunch of bushes. And then, so you're either too close or you're too far away. But I think that's kind of what was going on here. But he's talking even at that time that these plants are on the verge of extermination. They're readily being collected. Cactus can be used for food and, a water source. But basically all of the changes that were going on in the Keys took what were once very robust populations. Major crashes were witnessed, which led to the species being added to the endangered species list in 1984. And so at the time, this is where things kind of get complicated with cacti in general usually. The species concepts are kind of always changing as we learn more about them. So at this time in 1984, it was thought that Pilosocereus rubinii, the key tree cactus, was endemic to the Florida Keys, and it was the only thing found there. J.K. Small thought there were a few different species, but largely by 1984, there was one species, and it was only found in the Keys. We learned shortly after it's also in the Bahamas and Cuba, and we've done some work since then. But basically, it gets to this issue of, you can't protect what you don't understand, so it becomes really important to know what you're dealing with. It's been a struggle, let's just say, over the years. So a little bit more about Pilosocereus in general. They're shrubby to arborescent in habit, and habit just means kind of their growth form. They have columnar branches, so those kind of tall branches that you saw, and they have nocturnal flowers that are pretty short as cacti flowers go, and they're adapted for bat pollination. So that's an interesting thing right away for the Keys, is we don't have bats that, pollinator bats. We have like insectivorous bats, but we don't have the kind of bats that pollinate flowers. As you can see from some of these photos though, there are some sphingids and some moths that we think are also functional pollinators, but they're primarily bat pollinated. We think that we had these bats at one point, but we haven't, in recorded time at least. So it speaks to, are these populations in Florida almost vestigial? If they don't have their primary pollinator, is that something that's led to the crash? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Another characteristic of this group is the pericarpals don't have areoles. And the pericarpal, it's kind of a fancy word for the hypanthium or the floral cup. I don't have a pointer, but if you look at the top image C, that's a pretty good example. So that's the hypanthium or the pericarpal, and it basically doesn't have spines on it. Most cactus flowers have some kind of spines or areoles, on that pericarpal. And then also they have kind of depressed globose fruits that are irregularly dehiscent. So that's actually kind of how they open. They just kind of split randomly. They actually, they look very edible and delicious. And the inside is okay, very seedy. But the outside's actually pretty thick and leathery. So usually wildlife don't get to it until it kind of cracks open on its own. So to talk about this Pilosocereus millspaughii, we really have to talk about the history of conservation of Pilosocereus in the Keys in general. And so Fairchild has primarily been the lead on this as far as funding, but we've worked with a lot of partners in terms of National Wildlife Refuge, Fish and Wildlife, DEP, particularly Janice Ducanel in particular. If any of you know her, she's kind of our, what was your name again? She's like our Jackie. If that means anything to you, like a lot of this couldn't happen without this single person. Yeah, we've done range-wide censuses and population monitoring since 2007. We've studied the in situ microhabitat conditions, trying to figure out what is it that these cacti like, where do they want to be. We've done ex situ salinity trials, kind of testing their salinity tolerance, done genetics, developed horticultural methods, we've hosted meetings, done a lot of seed research, we've rescued plants in the wild, and we've done several experimental reintroductions. And this is just, I don't expect you to read all this on the left, but these are some of the publications we've generated. But just to show, we received a fair amount of funding between, basically over a 10-year period between 2006 and 2015. We don't currently receive funding to work with this species anymore, but over that time, we learned a lot and we conducted a lot of successful reintroductions. And we published several papers that hopefully other folks can use for Pilosocereus conservation in general. So we learned that seed viability is very high. The seeds are orthodox, meaning they're capable of orthodox storage. So this is one of, in plant conservation, it's our kind of, I always think of it as the low-hanging fruit. So it just means that the seeds can be dried and frozen, and so we can keep seeds alive. We could keep thousands of genetic individuals theoretically alive for, 100+ years sometimes. They take up almost no space, and it's the cost of a freezer and a backup battery. So one of the first things we do when we work with a species is try to figure out, can we bank the seeds? We studied the genetics. We figured out salinity differences, and that a lot of the decline we were seeing was due to soil salinity. And we documented the further population crash, which was unfortunate. So speaking back to the pollination question, where we were like, man, if these guys aren't being effectively pollinated, maybe we can create more robust plants that will do better if we do crosses. So we did this was an intern, Sarah Pinter, in 2016, and her and I would go out at night, and we would, because these flowers open at night because they're bat pollinated, and I don't know if I mentioned, but they smell really strong of garlic. It's like a really distinct strong smell. It's pretty cool. It's just funky the first time I smelled it. But so we did kind of controlled reciprocal crosses. So we're crossing pollen from individuals, and some of these were between populations, some were among populations. And we also generated 6 self seeds. So we just kind of pollinated a plant with another flower from the same individual. And we generated thousands of seeds from this. And then our other interns the following year did germination studies, and they looked at the number of seeds generated per fruit, the mean weight of seeds, and germination rates, and we didn't find any statistical difference here. So perhaps this pollination limitation isn't as big a factor as we thought. But we will see, we still have a lot of these plants growing, and how they survive and their vigor over time is another thing we plan on studying. Oop. So we've done 3 rounds of kind of major reintroductions. As you can see, their survival isn't amazing. In 2012, we did kind of experimental introductions along an elevation gradient, kind of basically where the plants are currently found in an elevation that's slightly higher, where the habitat changes a little bit. And we did find, go figure, that the plants did a lot better in the habitat that they're currently found in. So these introductions were done on Windley Key, which actually contains the highest natural elevation in the Keys, which is like a whopping 3.5 meters, more or less. Yeah. In cultivation? Amazing. We almost never lose them. Yeah, they grow great in the greenhouse and out on the deck, but we want these, and we have a robust collection. We probably right now have over 100 individuals of probably at least 60 unique genetic individuals, and we have a ton of seedlings and thousands of seeds, which I'll mention a little later. But so at Windley Key in 2015, we tried to find areas of high elevation, actually on 2 different keys. There's like the 2 highest elevation points in the Keys that had somewhat open habitat. And we wanted to see if, it's like they're cactus, right? They want to survive. And we had pretty good survival for a couple of years, but they just kind of teetered out over time. But we still have several that are alive today and thriving, but our survival was clearly not what we were hoping for. Yeah. We can't always tell why. So usually what we see is kind of secondary causes, like we'll see rotting, and we've given tissue to extension of like, what is this bacteria or agent that's causing the rot, and they're all secondary. I think they refer to them as secondary pathogens. But like, what is the cause that actually causes them to become unhealthy and get infested and start rotting? We have not gotten to the bottom of that. But so when we do these outplantings, it may not sound like a lot of plants, but we have to bring these plants down in a U-Haul. If they're small, we package them very tightly in cardboard. And we're doing these plantings in coral rock. So we often have to bring out an auger, and even once we use the auger, we have to go in with a big digging bar. So even getting a single plant in the ground, and we can't get the auger out into quality habitat. So this was in kind of a restoration area. But when we're working out in quality habitat, it's all digging bars and pickaxes, and so it is a lot of work. And we have to haul out, we use a lot of limestone pea rock and sand to kind of fill the holes when we plant them. So it's quite an undertaking. It takes a lot of volunteers and help from the land managers. Here's some photos from the 2012 and 2015. It's Chris Migliaccio on the right there. That's Janice Ducanel in the green from the State Park Service, the one our Jackie. So today, based on these outplantings, though, even though our success hasn't been what we would love, we still have over 2/3 of the existing individuals in the wild, especially in terms of this is done in centimeters of vertical stem. So one of the things with these cacti, they make vegetative fragments. So if a stem falls over, it can create new plants. So we're often not interested in the number of individuals. We like genetic individuals, but we're usually, how much vertical stem do we have? Because these guys ultimately, to reproduce, they want to get above the canopy and flower and fruit, and they can get 30, 40 feet tall. So yeah, we've had some success relative to the wild populations. And so today, there are 4 wild populations remaining and 8 outplanted populations. And now we'll get back to this Pilosocereus millspaughii, the population that we lost in Upper Key Largo. So to talk about this, I mentioned kind of taxonomic issues. I worked on this paper. Alan Frank really gets all the credit for this, but a bunch of us worked on this, and we revised the taxonomy of Pilosocereus throughout the Caribbean and the Northern Andes region. And this is for the first time where this other population in Florida was formally recognized as Pilosocereus millspaughii, which is also found. This is the kind of white circles here. Oh, you can't see my cursor, but the white circles are P. millspaughii. So it's a somewhat broad range, throughout eastern Cuba and the Bahamas. And Pilosocereus rubinii, the one that's actually federally endangered, is only found, there's just a few populations in northern Cuba and the Bahamas. But all of these are at low elevations and still at threat. So the differences between these two, this is Pilosocereus millspaughii, the key largo tree cactus. It's the common name we've dubbed it because common names don't matter. So one thing you notice is the flowering areoles, and an areole of a cactus is where the spines come from. So the flowering areoles, you actually on these plants you get what are called pseudocephalia, which are like the reproductive sections of the stem. So these almost look like a Dr. Seuss plant to me. You get these long flowing silken hairs that come from the flowering areoles, and even at the time of flowering, you still have some hairs at the base of the pericarpal. And whereas with Pilosocereus rubinii, you have some pilose hairs in the areoles, but like comparatively, they're almost glabrous, and there are no hairs at the base of the pericarpal. Yeah, sure. Oop. I mean, that one's probably 40, maybe 50 feet tall. Tall to the point where it's very hard to measure. We have these telescopic poles, and they start waving in the wind, but 40 feet is not unheard of. But generally speaking, a lot of the stuff in the Keys, like nothing's that height anymore. We have maybe one individual that's maybe 20 feet tall. It's probably the tallest one right now. But again, throughout their range, there's still parts of Brazil and the Caribbean where not these species, but Pilosocereus are common, and they can get pretty huge. I don't know, this keeps changing on its own. What's that? Not in Florida, not anymore, but they did until a few years ago. So this population wasn't even discovered until 1992. I took this photo in 2017 after some population crashes had already started. But you can see those flowering areoles and the flowers and fruits way up towards the top. We have thousands of seeds. So one of the things that was really cool about this population, it was found in this limestone outcrop that was otherwise surrounded by mangroves. Almost all of the green you see in this photo so this is mangroves, and then here we get into tropical hardwood hammock. But we had these limestone outcrops that are, maybe a foot higher than the surrounding mangroves, and they had really unique vegetation for this area. So in this same, you're supposed to see that. In the same area where this cactus was found, so we had Prosthecia boothyiana, the dollar orchid, which isn't found anywhere else in that area. We find it in Miami-Dade and other areas, but as far as the Northern Keys, the Tillandsia cetacea was the only population in the Keys, and the Pleopeltis polypodioides, which is the tropical resurrection fern. It's just a handful of populations in Florida, and it's the only one in the Keys that we know of currently. So just in this little patch, there were just all these, it's kind of like a funky vegetation type for the area. I just wanted to show, this was the Hericea fragrans. So this is some pretty extreme, what they call fasciation, just kind of deformities. These usually have very just tall, cylindric stems. And this one, through some unique deformity, made probably the most beautiful cactus I've ever seen. So from our population monitoring of this species, you can see, prior to 2015, we had this big kind of thriving population. Again, it's really hard to photograph to really give you a sense, but in 2015 is when we really started noticing serious changes. And when we were in the field, and this was the first and only time we saw this, but we had major herbivory going up and down all the way through all of the kind of vascular cambium, like down to the woody caudex, or the cortex rather. And this was probably on 70% of the stems. And we think this was black rat. We put out some game cameras afterwards. We were never actually like able to nail a culprit, but just the size of the bite marks and the patterns, we think it was the non-native black rats. And so this is the following year. Almost all of those stems that were chewed up just really started to crash. And this is one of the things, so again, when we talk about sea level rise being kind of a dynamic and, you know, really that's the word, just not a straightforward process. So we were getting these king tide flooding events around this time. And again, we weren't monitoring this aspect of it at the time, so we can't really say. But there was no fresh water in the area for little mammals at the time when they're flooding with the seawater. So if you found a big population of cactus, I don't know what I'm touching. If you find a big population of cactus, you can get a lot of fresh water and nutrients. So again, we can't prove that, but it seems just like a logical conclusion that, you know, that the saltwater flooding kind of caused this first herbivory event that, you know, really led to the further demise. There you can see that Tillandsia cetacea. And so 2017, and things just kind of keep getting worse. We're just documenting a decline. This is in 2020. It's hard to see in these photos, but if you can see a little bit of a sheen, there's actually kind of standing salt water at the plants. And that was in January, so that was long after the king tides. So, you know, this flooding is lasting a long time. And the vegetation's totally changed at this point. And this was kind of the last large adult. And you can see how big that trunk was. That easily would have been 40 feet tall before it lost all of its stems. And this was kind of the last one that crashed. And so just on this note, I want to show these photos. Because we weren't studying this at the time, we were just kind of monitoring the plants. We've started going to other rare plant populations and putting out game cameras during these king tide events. And we have little meter sticks so we can try to get an idea of, you know, the height and the duration of the flooding period. And so this was the final rescue in 2021, where we really at this point, you know, again, it was flooding with salt water so much, there wasn't any healthy material out there. We made a decision to kind of rescue the remaining fragments. You can see a lot of halophytes, like this is, you know, Sueda linearis, and there was Batis maritima, these things that, these plants that we call them halophytes, they really like high salinity conditions, and they actually kind of cause a feedback loop where they have so much salt in their tissue that their litter kind of keeps the soil salty, so it promotes conditions for themselves. So once you get an area that kind of fills up with these salt-loving plants, you're kind of already part of a cycle, a feedback loop. So just to show some of the work that went into this, again, we had to hike all of these buckets and gear out through the mangroves. There's a team of us hiking buckets out through the mangroves. And there was one remaining fruit on the time that we think was, you know, perhaps wild pollinated. And because there were so many critters out there, and it was near the ground, we put a cage on it. We were able to sell, you know, the fruit on the right didn't end up having any viable seed in it, but we were able to get several seeds from that fruit on the left. So from that effort, we had 36 rescues. So we currently have 36 living individuals from this effort. We have 25 additional seedlings at Fairchild, and just we kind of split the material. I think, excuse me, the John Pennekamp State Park, I think they have 6 individuals, and we kept 30. Forgive me, I'm spacing on the exact number. But we have over 1,000 seeds banked of this species, so we can grow a lot more cactus. It's just about, right now we have 0 funds for it, and we need to just figure out where to put them because the habitats keep changing. So, pardon me? Will you be reintroducing the tree cactus? We're absolutely going to. We have plans, probably not this year, but 2026, because we've grown a lot of seedlings and we have young plants that are ready to go out. One thing we found is that the larger plants, like we want to put out larger plants, but their survival is actually a lot worse. You know, so it's like we actually find we do better putting out smaller plants, but it's, you know, it's still a bit of a crapshoot because it just takes a lot longer for them to get to reproductive size. Yeah. But yeah, so we are planning more events, but we currently don't have any funding for it. We just need to find all the right partners. We're probably going to do it with the refuge system or the state parks. But again, there's just a limited amount of habitat, and we just need to figure out where exactly we're putting them. And so now I'll spend a few minutes just talking about other work we're doing with cactus in general in the Keys. So I was talking to Valerie earlier about Flipper. We got some Flipper money, which is the Florida Plant Rescue, to bank seeds of Hericea fragrans. That was that crazy fasciated cactus I showed you earlier. And we got several hundred seeds of that species. That's Sam Walsdorf on the lower left holding a fruit she just collected. And we have a lot of seeds banked for all of these other species. And then I just wanted to mention down on the lower right, I went out with Danielle Green from Naples Zoo and some folks from Marie Selby, including like Bruce Holst and Sean McCourt. I don't know if they interact with this chapter much, but we did some Hericea aboriginum rescues after Hurricane Milton. So we salvaged some damaged stems then, and so we've developed further ex situ collections of those populations. And I want to mention the Consolea coralicula. This is also known as the semaphore cactus. So this cactus is endemic to South Florida. There's only 2 populations remaining, and they're all clones, and they're all functionally male. So, but one of the unique things about this species, so it has true males, like individuals that they're only functionally male, individuals that are true females, and then occasionally it makes these individuals that we call weak hermaphrodites that are kind of largely male, like they produce viable pollen, but they also can produce sweet seeds and get swollen ovaries, but they're kind of deformed. So one of the theories that a colleague had that did research with this species previously is that they're obligate crossers. So we now have material from 3 different genotypes that don't breed with each other and they don't produce fruit. But we've been trying to do crosses where we're pollinating a different genotype from a male to a weak hermaphrodite. And we haven't had success yet, but we've had plants produce seeds, but they're just deformed, and like the fruity, sugary arils that you think of like a dragon fruit, those come out almost rocky. So there's something really funky going on with the reproduction that we haven't sorted out yet. And perhaps this is just an evolutionary dead end, but we're really trying to explore what our options are of producing new, because if we can get sexual reproduction in this species, that would be a major conservation success. So I just wanted to point out too, I drove by the ravenous pig earlier, and I noticed a cool tropical cactus. It's Consolea rubescens. This one looked like a female, but again, there's no male around to pollinate it, so it probably won't make fruits. But I could see the stigmas, and they still produce anthers, but they're much lower in the floral cup, and they probably don't produce viable pollen. But yeah, if you ever, this is, I don't know, a mile up the road or something. If you ever want to check it out, very cool tropical cactus. It's another one that can make a big tree, so it's not in the best spot. But I thought I'd throw that in at the last minute. So now to one of my favorite groups, and I'll try not to spend too much time. I'm probably already over my time, and I apologize. But so the Opuntias. I talked about the interesting work that's been done with the evolution of Opuntias. And this just goes to show how much, and again, these taxonomic issues and figuring out what species we even have. So this was, again, Lucas Major and Walter Judd worked on this too, who was my first botany teacher. And Lucas was actually my first TA. But so we had the species Opuntia triacanthos. It's kind of a long story, but there's these two of the major clades of Opuntia, the Humifusa clade, which is most of what we think of our local stuff, Ostrina, Mesacantha, and then the Nopalea clade, which is very much a tropical Caribbean clade. And so we had this species that we thought was from the Caribbean, but then when we actually did molecular work, well, I should say when they did molecular work, they found that it was part of the Humifusa clade, so a descendant of North American material that only has 2 populations left in the wild. So it went from being this thing, we thought we had this cool tropical species at the northern edge of its range to now, perhaps one of the rarest cacti in the world, certainly up there. And another thing that came from that was, I mentioned that allopolyploid hybrid, Opuntia ochrocentra. So this Opuntia abjecta is one of the putative parents with, Opuntia stricta or Opuntia delenii being the other parent. So you have these mix of the two clades that created this cool allopolyploid hybrid that's, totally exists now. So I put a petition package together, and after I reviewed it with some of our local fish and wildlife folks, because I was like, this cactus is as rare as it gets. But we felt like this single species perhaps wasn't enough. So we've since gone back to the drawing board. And if we list this, we certainly should list Opuntia ochrocentra. And we're still figuring out, perhaps there's some other forms of this Austrhinoclade that we haven't even correctly identified yet. And then this was a project that I had put together with Dave Bender and my coworker Jen, that we wanted to try to rediscover some endemic Opuntias. And so basically, I have an animation here. And I'll just mention this for a second. So have you heard of J.K. Small's Cactus Garden at Buena Vista? It was really cool. So he was particularly interested in Opuntias and also recognized how similar all these different species can look. We call it kind of cryptic speciation. So he had this big garden. This was all funded by Charles Deering, who was kind of a local millionaire philanthropist. And he grew all of these species, kind of in a common garden experiment and watched them grow side by side for years and years. And see when the forms were consistent and, if they're all grown in the same conditions. And so he observed these different species for over 30 years. And so two of the species that I'm particularly interested in that he described that aren't currently recognized, they're recognized in the weekly flora, so the flora of the southeastern US, and a few others, but they're not yet recognized by our state atlas or let alone Fish and Wildlife. This is Opuntia chiensis. It's another almost tree-forming Opuntia. It gets pretty tall, kind of like that Consolea we were looking at a minute ago, and has these beautiful salmon-colored flowers. And one of the things with this species too is it appears almost spineless, but it actually tends to have a lot of spines that are just hidden beneath the glockids, those little hairs that really annoy you if you've ever handled an Opuntia. So they're actually super spiny, but they're really short and they're kind of hidden by the glockids. And it's actually kind of variable as we examine more individuals. But this is the original description of the species by J.K. Small, which the concept is based on. I expect you to read it, but just kind of cool to share. Here's some photos. This is a plant from Lover's Key. And again, you can see in the center, a pretty thick woody trunk, almost tree forming. And this was after Hurricane Milton. This cactus was knocked over. It's still alive. It's resprouted vegetatively, but it might take a few years to reclaim its glory. And this is a species I really love, Opuntia zebrina. It's named zebrina for those bands on the spines, kind of like zebra stripes, which sometimes we get on Opuntia stricta. But so this is kind of a stricta-looking cactus, but it's much lower growing, much fatter pads, and it has these really distinct banded kind of red-orange spines. It's really beautiful. It's known from two populations, perhaps three at this point. I actually just found a new one about a month ago that I was really excited about. I was able to vouch for it. We've brought some material into our ex situ collection. So we are growing plants. And so we're kind of erring on the side of caution. Even if it doesn't get recognized, we are recognizing it as unique material at the very least. So we're starting to do work with it. The molecular work, though, the genetics for cacti is just so expensive. Because you have to do, this work we do is we look at 353 nuclear loci, and it just costs $8,000 to run a tray of samples. So I can get the labor. I have students that'll do all the extractions and stuff, but it's just trying to get the money together to run the plates that we're hoping to do. And even then, with all the polyploidy and stuff, the genetics just get really complicated. But we think there's a lot of good work to be done here. So in the meantime, we are developing ex situ collections. And so what's next? We're going to continue banking seeds. As I mentioned, we're going to look at doing reintroductions in 2026. And then there's always this kind of conundrum of assisted migration, meaning taking species outside of their historical range. There's different schools of thought on the topic. Some of these key species, there's folks that think that the best thing we can do is just kind of granting them a graceful extinction, because the sea level is going to come up like it has done in the past. But then there's arguments that habitats that they could occupy are taken up, and so their ability to disperse is very limited. So we're kind of working with regulators and land managers. There's a lot of kind of tape that we have to go through, and we can't just put cactus wherever we want. So one of the, that's redundant. But one of the things that was pitched that we had this Keys kind of working group meeting was, I swear I'm not touching anything, was developing rooftop gardens as kind of an educational display, like talking about sea level rise and a place for these cacti and other key species to remain, to kind of have these, kind of ex situ collections that we try to make them somewhat wild on a rooftop. The Botanical Research Institute of Texas has an amazing example of this. If you guys ever have the chance to go there, they created a black prairie on their roof. And they like brought in the local soils, and they have like a functioning ecosystem up there. It's amazing. So that was the inspiration for that. And there's so many people to thank that have done work on these various species over the years. I won't go through all of them, but thanks to them, and thanks to all of you for having me. And I'll take any questions you might have.
All right, Jimmy's here. I think I have everything. Let's try my camera again. Nope, okay. So nobody gets to see me. But we don't have any questions in the chat yet, but while we were back here, we were just chatting about this Cactus Island Nursery's comment about BTK mixed with spinosad with the Cactoblastis cactorum moth. Do you have any comments on that, Jimmy?
I was actually, really excited to hear that. I haven't personally tried anything with that, but I know we've been working with FWC and Key Deer National Wildlife Refuge, and the Cactoblastis hasn't been terrible for some of the Opuntias lately, but Opuntia zebrina, one that I mentioned that I'm particularly worried about, has been getting hit really hard this year, and they've been going out and kind of hand removing, so I'm interested to hear more, and I may try to reach out to the folks from that nursery. I already Googled while we were waiting, but yeah, I think it's interesting. I want to try. I'd have to look into. Sometimes there's issues with applying these things on public land, so I'd have to look into kind of some of the nuances there. But I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, Cactus Island says they mix both in a backpack sprayer.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll look into that, because the folks at FWC have been, we're particularly worried about these Opuntia zebrina populations. We were able to get fruit for the first time about a week ago, so we're pretty excited about that. But yeah, there's a lot of moth damage. So thanks for sharing it, and I'll probably reach out to you separately for more info. It's great.
Sounds great. So guys, we need some questions. Bring your questions to the table. Put them in the chat. I do have one for you though, Jimmy. So I watch all these lectures, and obviously I'm really lucky to be learning all of this about, plant evolutionary biology and speciation in Florida. But I have trouble keeping the million years ago intact, like in context. So like, oh, sea level rose at this time, and then these species speciated. And in my mind, it's all just like a long time ago, and then a little bit longer time ago.
You're not alone in that. Yeah. Geologic time is daunting.
Okay. So no like mental tricks to be like this is what it looked like, or this is what it felt like at a certain time, or this is just distance from present. You just maybe memorize the numbers.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. So often, we think about kind of the Wisconsin glaciation and just kind of, areas in Florida, and kind of generally that's as far back as my mind goes reliably, and I don't have any great tricks for that. But yeah, I mean, we think of kind of the beyond like the Lake Wales Ridge, most of the Florida peninsula is geographically pretty young. And so it's, we get this spillover from multiple floras. But yeah, I wouldn't say I have any kind of great tricks of keeping those in mind. I always kind of have to recheck myself. But I think of, down where I work in South Florida, some of the key numbers that we often think about is the Everglades, for example, as we know them, have only been around for somewhere around 5,000 years. So that the landmass was exposed for tens of thousands of years before that, but kind of when we started getting, the sheet flow and the peat accumulation to have like the Everglades as we know them today. So that's often one that I use just in a geologic context of how young an ecosystem can be kind of geologically. And one of the points, and I don't recall if I mentioned it in this talk or not, but one of the kind of points of reference I often use is Madagascar as a number that I keep in my head.
Yeah, you mentioned it.
Is about 98 million years old.
Okay. So,
I mean, just like orders of magnitude. But yeah, I think it is a good idea to kind of have some of those, key dates locked in your mind, but I often don't and have to kind of keep looking back to them. But those are a few that I have in my head.
Cool, thank you. Also, I have planned a trip to come visit these cacti, and I appreciate, all the locations provided in the video. Is there anything else you'd like to say to people who want to go check these guys out?
Well, most of these locations are, not shared widely with the public, but if you generally know the habitats and know where to go, you're kind of looking for these intermediate habitats between hammocks and mangrove. We kind of get, I often call them thorn scrub, coastal rock barren is another term. But when you start seeing a lot of spiny plants like saffron plum and barbed wire cactus and things like that, you're probably at least in the right general habitat. And I'll say, from my perspective, often so much of our work is revisiting these populations that we know about. And, each year when we do that, we always try to kind of go survey and sample some new area, but it's always just a small subset of what's actually out there. There's a lot of potential habitat for some of these species, both on public and private land, and as many eyes as we can have out there looking for these things. We've found new populations several times, so it can happen. It just takes getting out there and looking.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the pitfalls often of working with rare plants is you're visiting these known populations and collecting all of this data, and maybe not spending enough time actually exploring and surveying, other sites. Because these populations are dynamic.
Right. Well, we don't have any questions, just thanks. We're very grateful for the presentation, and
Yeah, thank you, Valerie, and thanks for everybody for coming and listening to my talk. I can't see any of you, but I appreciate your interest in native plants, and maybe we can do something like this again sometime. And Valerie, please, like I said, reach out when you come down to the Keys. I'd love to go out in the field with you and show you around a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. That would be really fun.
All right.
Okay, bye everybody.